All right, it is 10 o'clock, so we are going to get started with our 10 o'clock session. Please welcome Jeff DeBell from Cascade Woodland Design. Jeff, I turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thanks. Well, welcome everybody. Just so you know a little bit about my background, I'm here as a consulting forester, work mostly with small landowners, and there's a group of us in this company. We specialize in properties where things like aesthetics and wildlife and recreation are important goals. And the reason I mention that is that some of the advice and stuff is influenced by the fact that we work on smaller scales with folks. If I was a consulting forester who mostly worked with clients who own, hundreds or thousands of acres, some of the little details might be a little bit different in terms of how because that's sort of getting into a almost commercial scale more. And so most landowners are smaller than that. That's why I'm going to stay focused on where I work. But just if you happen to be one of those landowners that's larger scale, just keep in mind that my advice is would maybe be a little bit different for you. I also work, if you're in the forestry world, you might see my name associated with reforestation and genetics, because that's my uh, day job with DNR. And in my former jobs with DNR, a long time ago, I used to work as a field forester, setting up timber sales and overseeing timber sales, and then actually supervised the timber sales program on Capitol Forest for a while. So I have some of that larger scale stuff in my background, but these days I'm more at the small scale. In terms of the outline of what we'll talk about today, talk just briefly about some options for timber harvesting, um, and the physical process of logging, some of the administrative things, and then I think we should have time to go over a list put together by there was a consulting forester named Ron Monroe that some of you may have met. He passed away a few years ago, but he often did this session and had, I think, very good advice on a little list. So I'll share that with you. So the first thing I wanted to just touch on is that there are a broad range of options for timber harvesting. Even if you have a fairly small parcel, you can thin, you can cut little patches, or you can cut large areas. And the reason I wanted to mention this is that I know a lot of you will be smaller size parcel landowners, and I've talked with landowners who've been told by foresters or loggers that really they had to cut their whole 20 acres, or it wasn't worth it, or those sort of things. And it's not that these people are being dishonest. It's just that they are operating at a more commercial scale. Their equipment is different, the way they charge is different, all that sort of thing. An analogy might be if you wanted to till up a small part of your backyard to have a garden in the summer, and you talk to somebody with a 300 horsepower tractor and a disc that was 30 feet wide, they would say there's no way, they can't help you. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ways to till your little garden in the backyard. You just have to find the right piece of equipment or the right person or whatever. And so it's kind of similar with logging. For your situation, scale is really important to understand that, and that's a whole different discussion that I'm not talking about today. But just so you're aware that you do probably have more options than you might realize, provided there is value in the timber. I have also worked on some properties that haven't been well cared for by the previous owner, and there's so little value there that there's very few options. So you can get in those situations. And both the loggers just have to have the right setup. So while there are loggers that come in with big hot saws and processors and all that kind of stuff that you see on a large commercial operation, there are also loggers that just come in with their sometimes one person operations with a skidder and a self loader, and they can handle very small scale things. So we'll go through the physical process, what happens on the ground. Um, I'll start with just a little bit of terminology in case some of you aren't familiar.
Hey, Jeff, can I
A little
jump
bit
in
of
for a
words like
second here? We
certainly,
do
yeah.
have a question I'd like you to take now, which is will you define small parcel for us, please?
Oh, okay. I was just thinking if you look at land ownership, really across the nation, Um, some landowners might own, hundreds or thousands of acres, but there's lots of landowners that might just have 5 acres or 10 acres or things like that that aren't really scaled the same as large commercial operations that might own tens of thousands of acres. And so I don't have a specific cutoff for what's small, but I mean, I've literally worked for people who own 2 acres and then up to people who own over 100. But most of the people I work with are going to own somewhere between 5 and 40 acres. That sort of a scale. And so does that help? Okay, I'll assume so, Kevin, unless you jump in and ask for further clarification. Uh, so just in terms of terminology, in this diagram, which comes from Oregon State University, the red squares are landings. And so landings are the places where the logs get moved from the trees, from the stump, to a place where a log truck can be loaded to haul them off to the mill. And then that red line would represent your forest road. And the dashed lines or the dotted lines would be the skid trail. So this isn't, trucks don't drive on these. This is logging machines that are bringing the logs to the landings, to the squares where they can be loaded. And if you're on in rugged terrain, then the landings, or if you're working with forest engineers, they might call these settings, um, are really kind of set. You have to be in certain places just to be able to reach things with cable systems or whatever you're using. And then that kind of defines where your roads need to be. And sometimes that's different than where your roads are right now. But most of the folks I work with aren't on real rugged topography. And if it's more gentle, we can usually just work with the existing road and figure out places to put landings to where we can reach whatever they need to reach. But I just wanted to kind of go over that terminology a little bit, the difference, what's a road, what's a skid trail, what's a landing. So in terms of the physical uh, steps in timber harvesting, the first stage would be felling and bucking. So you're cutting down the tree, taking off the limbs and cutting them into log lengths. Because usually a tree will have several different logs in it, not always, but often. And that can be anywhere from a person doing this all by hand with a chainsaw to fairly sophisticated machines like you see on the right, where the machine cuts the tree off, turns it sideways, cuts off all the limbs and cuts those to length and puts them in piles. And on larger operations, you may also see whole tree length, so logging where the tree is simply felled, dragged all the way to the landing, and it's at the landing where all the delimbing and cutting to length happens. That happens with a big machine called a processor, but uh, those are expensive to move in. So if you own 5 acres or something like that, you're probably not going to see that kind of a machine. You're going to be more like the situation on the left where you have an individual cutter and then maybe a skidder of some sort. Once the trees are cut, whether they're bucked in the woods or bucked at the landing, you have to get those stems to the landing. And in steep topography, that's going to be some kind of a cable system. More commonly on with small landowners, if their topography is more gentle, it'll be some kind of a skidder, like you see in the middle, which might be a rubber tire skidder or a track skidder, just sort of dragging those logs to the landing. Or if conditions are open enough, there's enough space between the trees. Sometimes you'll see a machine like the one on the right. This is called shovel logging, and the way it works is sort of like a loader type machine, and they just grab all the logs and put them in a little pile, and then move the machine a few feet toward the landing and move that pile and just keep doing that over and over till the logs are already there. And although that might sound like it would be slow, the first time you hear about it, it's actually more efficient than having a skidder run back and forth. And so on the larger commercial operations, clear cuts and things like that, that's at least on the west side, that's the most common yarding method that you'll see. Then the logs will be brought to the landings and loaded onto trucks for hauling off to mills. And what you'll see happening at the landing is there'll be different piles of logs, right? Because the different mills are set up for different species or different products. And so they take different diameters of logs or grades of logs or whatever. And so the landing is the place where these are sorted into different groups. And then each time a truck comes in, logs from one sort or one group, one kind will be put on that truck to be taken to a specific mill. Now, there will be times that you won't have enough logs to fill a whole truck. You know, maybe if it's a real small property with several different kinds of trees on it, or toward the end of a logging operation where you maybe just have 3 or 4 of each kind of log left, and it doesn't pay to just load 3 or 4 logs on a truck and haul those. So there are, at least where I work, some places will buy mixed loads, and so the way that works is the log truck will just go there, they'll unload the log truck, and then they'll put them in different stacks. And when they get enough of each kind, then they'll ship it off to a mill that needs that kind of log. And I guess you'll get, in most of the time, less money selling mixed loads like that because they have to do all the merchandising and that. But it's a good way to be able to sell small quantities of logs where you don't have full loads. That's kind of the physical process of what you'll see happening on land. And then, of course, there's always paperwork and administrative process or preparation, making arrangements. And I'll go over some of those things. The first is getting your harvest area marked. And this isn't, of course, paperwork necessarily, but it's critical preparation, even before you get a permit. And so you can have several different scenarios where you need that boundary mark. One might be marking the boundary at the edge of a stream buffer where you're going to stop cutting trees, not getting too close to the stream. Another might be just completely in your property, but you just want to stop the logging at that point and leave the trees on the other side. And then the third would be where you're cutting up to your property line and someone else owns the trees on the other side of that. And anytime that you are coming up against another piece of property, you really want to be 100% sure you know exactly where that line is. And so if you're in a situation where you're just in through the middle of the woods and you're not completely sure exactly where that line is, which side of every tree it goes on, then I always recommend that you get a surveyor to come in and mark that line. There are some consulting foresters who have the tools to mark those if it's not a survey. So I want to differentiate between a survey where you don't know where the corners of the property are and those have to be established, versus one where you can find all the corners, but you just can't see from corner to corner. And then you need to know, connect through the woods, connect that line. And a surveyor can do either of those things. Um, Consulting forester with the right equipment could connect the existing corners. We don't do that, but some people do. What you're going to see if a surveyor marks that line for you is they usually will put then wooden stakes on the line. And I always suggest that if a landowner has this done, they mark with a permanent stake. So sometimes we use these carcinite posts, sort of a fiberglass product that will last, essentially forever. So when that wooden stake rots, you haven't lost that. Or some people like to use metal T-posts. That works fine as well. They're just heavier to carry around in the woods. But whatever you do, if you're going to spend the money to have that connected, my advice is mark it permanently. Think beyond this current operation so you don't have to repeat that process 20 years down the line. If you have a real clear boundary, like maybe your neighbor has already cut, and so it's real clear that there's a different age of timber between you and your neighbor. You don't necessarily have to mark this line. If both of you, if you're on good terms with your neighbor and you both feel good about that line between those two different tree ages, you can sign a cutting line agreement together, which doesn't change the legal boundaries of the property. It just says that you both agree that this line that's flagged between these two timber types is adequate for the purpose of timber harvest, and anything on your side you're allowed to cut, take, and anything on their side you're not. So that can be a reasonable option in some situations. Or if you have very clear things, like if there's a road, you don't necessarily have to mark anything. You can just specify the road as the boundary, or a fence that's been in place for a long time. You can simply say, that fence has been there, and we're just going to flag that up, and that's the boundary. But however you do it, Always be sure you're 100% clear on what the boundaries of your sale area are. You'll need a harvest permit. And in most cases, this is going to be a permit that comes from DNR, although there will be some cases where it might be a county permit. And those could be things like if your trees are within a tree length and a half of buildings, even a garage or shed, or if you're wanting to change some of the use to non-forest, like suppose you're cutting an area, but you want to reserve a couple acres for a house, or you want to make some, keep it open for a pasture or a garden or something, then sometime then you're into a county permit to handle those changes in land use. But most of the stuff that I see that's staying in forest, that's a DNR permit. Now, one thing that you should be aware of, at least in most of the places where I've worked, most of the counties where I work, if you get a DNR harvest permit approved, that triggers a 6-year building moratorium on that piece. And some I've even had cases where the county applies it to the entire parcel, despite the fact that the entire parcel is not in forest. So part of the parcel is in already in a house and a yard, and part of the parcel is in forest. Some counties, if you get the permit to work on the part that's in forest, they'll put that moratorium even on the open area, which is around your house, which doesn't seem right to me based on the intent of the law, but I don't make the rules. So the main reason I'm bringing it up is just for any of you to be aware, if you have plans for anything other than forest on your property, to be aware of this building moratorium angle on forest practice permits. Then you can decide how you want to sell your timber, and there's different ways of doing it. The major categories might be selling stumpage, which means you're selling the trees in their standing form, and whoever buys them is going to deal with hiring a logger and all that sort of thing. There's a couple of ways to do this. You could do a lump sum timber sale. And in that case, you're just kind of marking out an area and say, you can buy everything in this area. How much will you pay me? You agree on that amount. And then they're responsible for getting it logged. And your contract is not with the logger, it's with the buyer. And so any protections that you want for your property need to be in that contract with the buyer. Real similar to that, you're still kind of selling stumpage, but instead of just a lump sum, just a flat fee, you could sell that in terms of weight, like how many tons of timber come off or how many board feet scaled at the mill come off. So, but again, it's still the stumpage, and the buyer is who you're contracting with, and they're making all the logging arrangements. The other way you can sell your timber is selling the logs. In this case, you're going to hire the logger, and there's two major ways that you pay the logger. One is to pay the logger a fee per ton. So every ton of logs, they get paid a certain number of dollars. The other way that's very common, especially with smaller landowners, is just a percentage split. Lots of the smaller scale loggers work this way. And the idea there is every load of logs that goes to the mill, gets scaled or weighed or whatever is going to happen with that. And you've agreed on a split, like a certain percentage, whether that's 60-40 or 50-50 or whatever that works out to be. And it's very common that before that split, the trucking cost is deducted from the top. And it's important to make sure you're clear on that, because a lot of small loggers don't own their own trucks. They contract with a separate log truck driver, but some include that in their split. So I'll mention that a little bit later. I want to be clear on that point. One of the really important things to do, and I haven't seen it happen very often, but it can happen, is never cut before you have a buyer, someone who's going to buy your logs. Then assuming now if this is stumpage, you don't have to find the logger, but assuming you're going to sell the logs, you have to find a logger and agree on terms. So some of the important terms would be how the slash is going to be handled, because there's going to be lots of limbs and smaller diameter tops and things like that are left over that don't get hauled off to the mill. And you may want that spread across the property so it just rots in place and goes back into the soil. Or you may want that piled so you can burn it. If it's going to be piled, you need to be clear who's going to burn that. Is the logger going to burn it? Are you going to have it burned later? Think about road maintenance costs. So it's common when you're hauling these heavy trucks over roads, especially in wet weather, that maybe they need some more rock or need to be graded or whatever. Need to know who's going to handle those, who's paying for what with those. Uh, Reforestation, if you're depending, if it's just a thinning, you don't have to worry about this. But if you're cutting like little clear cuts or patches that have to be planted, it's important to know who's responsible for that. It's there's uh, loggers who will take care of that for you. I'm personally not a real big fan of that because their goals are not necessarily aligned with yours in terms of getting reforestation done, but it does happen, and I have seen some people do a good job of that. But whichever way, whether it's you're going to handle it or in your forester or the logger, that should be clear so there's no misunderstandings at the end. You don't get stuck with a reforestation bill that you weren't expecting. You need to know to have it clear the time period for the work, when the contract should start and when it needs to be done. And this isn't usually super rigid because there's all kinds of things that happen. Equipment breaks down or you get a patch of bad weather or whatever, but it should be, reasonably defined. So you're not sitting there with a contract and then nothing's happening and you have no way to deal with that. You want to talk about the logging rates, and that's whether you're paying on a per ton or whether it's a split. Make sure that that's clearly defined. And if the trucking is not part of that rate, be sure you know what the trucking rate is because you could agree to a percentage split with a logger. And then in some cases, they're actually doing the trucking and charging separately for that. And they may be charging more than you expect, which in effect gives them a higher percentage split than you're thinking when you just look at the normal split. So you want to be real clear how the trucking costs are handled. You want all of these things in a written contract. And if you're dealing with a lot of value and larger ownerships and you're selling timber regularly, I think it's a good idea to have an attorney help you with these contracts and review that and make sure you're really well protected. But I also work with some folks that it's a pretty small piece of property. The amounts of money involved are not great. And if they were to hire an attorney to do this for them, most of the money they made might be paid to the attorney to do that. And so, the contract is really about managing risk and protecting you from problems and things like that. And so that needs to be balanced with the cost of having a really carefully crafted contract. And so sometimes what we'll do working with the smaller scale landowners is Oregon State University Extension has a publication that has a number of example contracts in it. And maybe use that, adapt it for Washington. Their examples all say Oregon in them and things like that. But to me, the alternative is if the alternative is hiring an attorney that is going to eat up in legal fees all of the value of the timber, or not having a contract, or using the loggers, because a lot of loggers will have a contract. Maybe this OSU approach is kind of a good solution because if the logger has a contract, their attorney has written that to protect the logger. It doesn't mean it's necessarily bad for the landowner, but that wasn't the objective. That's that contract is to protect the logger's interest. And so this other way is kind of a less expensive way if the costs aren't real big. If we do that, I'm just real clear with the landowner on where this came from and be clear that we're not providing legal advice and all that kind of stuff. This is just a way that might work reasonably for them. And to me, when I look at that, I'm no attorney, but when I look at the clauses that are in that OSU thing, they're fairly similar to what I would expect in my experience. Another thing in terms of paperwork that's very important to have is that the logger covers you on their insurance policy. And I would tell you this is true for other kinds of contractors as well. Pre-commercial thinning, tree planting, anytime those kind of contractors are working on your property, it is routine business in forestry to have those contractors list you as additional insured on their liability insurance. And with loggers, it's loggers broad form. But what you'll get is either emailed to you or mailed a hard copy to you, a form on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper that looks, this is the top sheet of paper. Just took the top part, so I have all the names and everything below there. But it'll look like that. It'll have the date. It will list the contractor's name, the amounts of their insurance, and it'll have your name and address listed as an additional insured. And you should have this directly from the insurance agent before you let any work start. And like I said, we don't do that. We don't let any work start of any kind without this insurance in place. Because even if it's tree planting or something like that, which seems pretty safe, you could still have a vehicle accident or whatever might happen, and you want to be protected by their insurance. Once the once the logging starts happening, every load of logs that goes off your property should have a load ticket. Now, if you sold it lump sum and somebody just owns all the logs within uh, the area, and then you don't need to worry with this load ticket stuff. But if you're being paid, per thousand or per ton, or you've hired the logger and you're being paid by the mill, or you've done with a split and you're paid by the mill, you need to know the details of every load that leaves your property. And you can supply these tickets yourself if you're someone who does a lot of this, but the loggers you work with should also have ticket books like this. And each ticket is individually numbered. This is just like a receipt from the store. Okay. And these are carbon copied. So you write down the information, and there's like several copies. So one stays with the truck as it goes to the mill, but one should be left behind with you at the landing. And so if you're not there all the time, sometimes the logger can just keep it in their truck and give it to you every few days, or if you have a house, they can put it in a box that you set up or whatever. But you should be getting a copy of the ticket, or your forester, um, every load that leaves that landing. And what you do then is periodically, and it depends on the mills, maybe 2 weeks, maybe once a month, however different mills do it, you'll get a report from the mill. And that mill will list every load that showed up there. It will reference the log load ticket that came in with the truck, and it'll list the weight and the scaled volume if they're being scaled for how many thousand board feet. And then when you get your check each month, you should be able to cross-reference all these load tickets to make sure all the loads are accounted for and all that kind of stuff. And you don't necessarily have to do this yourself. This is, if you're working with a forester, the forester is going to take care of this for you. But if you're trying to do this on your own, I just wanted everyone to be aware that you should be doing that accounting just to make sure that everything is covered. Nothing was forgotten in the process. No loads were missing. Then there'll be harvest tax. And who pays this will actually depend on the timber owner. So if you're selling stumpage, the way the law works is it's the owner of the standing trees that pays the excise tax. So if you sold stumpage, then the buyer actually owns the standing trees. They'll pay that tax. But if you're selling logs, you're the owner of the trees. You'll pay the excise tax unless you make specific arrangements that you want the owner, I mean, excuse me, the logger to pay. But what'll happen when you fill out your forest practice permit with DNR, there's a line for your timber tax number. You have to get that timber tax number before you submit your application, and that goes into DNR, which is then fed over to Department of Revenue. And then you'll start getting returns. They'll send you each quarter your return that for you to file. And there's a place, if you haven't been logging or you're done logging, there's a place to checks. But if you have logged that quarter, you have to enter the volume and the logging costs and things like that. So just want you to be aware that's part of the overall paperwork and administration that's associated with logging. Then in the reforestation side, like I mentioned, some people have the logger take care of. Some loggers will take care of this. As I've mentioned, I prefer that we work with the landowner to take care of this. So we're really focused on the landowner's interests in making the decisions like seed source and species and all those things, planting quality, all the really important stuff. But just so you're aware, seedlings get often sold out pretty quickly. At a lot of nurseries, you'll want to put those orders in maybe August, early September, Because if you wait till later, December, January, February, when you're thinking about planting, the seedlings will often be sold out. So you need to be thinking ahead about this. Um, I will caution you that you want to be sure that that you're really lined up and you know it's going to be logged if the timing of logging might butt up against planting season at all. Because I've had this happen where I thought we were set up to log and then something happened and the logging date got pushed back. And because of that, it was pushing us later in the spring than we want to be planting trees. And in that case, we were fortunate that there was, seedlings were in short supply and it was not hard to find somebody who wanted to buy them. But some years that wouldn't be the case, and you could be stuck paying for seedlings that you either have to throw away or plant really too late in the seedling season for good survival. So it's kind of a balance between um, getting your orders in early versus jumping the gun a little too much if something goes wrong. And there are times when it's okay to just hold off and delay another year, and if as long as you're kind of controlling the brush and that sort of thing. Now I'll get to Ron Monroe's top 10 musts. And like I mentioned, Ron was a consulting forester who did a lot for the small landowner community, was involved in a lot of these courses with WSU. And although I have no way to get Ron's permission, I hope he would approve because I've seen him share this list many times. And so this is, kind of a way of honoring Ron for all that work he did and passing on some of his good advice. So I'll just go down this list. First, you must be sure you have the right to sell the timber. So there's cases where you have multiple owners of the timber, especially if, say, something's been in the family and then it's jointly owned by several kids. Everybody has to agree to sell that timber. One person doesn't have the legal right to do that on their own. Uh, you have to have legal access, and hopefully for most of you, this is not going to be an issue. But I have worked with landowners who, although they own property, have no right to drive across the road to get to their property across another piece of property. Or I've worked with people who have the right to the legal access for a passenger vehicle, but not for commercial like log trucks and heavy equipment, things like that. So if you don't have that, you can't haul timber off of your property. You can't get to the public roads. Now, there's ways to deal with this. Maybe you can work with the person who owns that road to get permanent easement. Or if they don't want to give you that, sometimes you can pay them for a temporary road use permit. But however you do it, before you get into where you are cutting trees, you need to be sure you have legal access, the legal right to haul. We've already talked about number two, you have to know your property lines and have them accurately marked in the field. Uh, you must have an approved harvest permit before anything starts. So it's not enough to have turned it in and you be sure it's approved and you have it in hand, and be sure you give a copy to your logger. Here's what this number four is one where I mostly agree with Ron, but there's a few cases where I would say there's some flexibility there. And he said you must have a reasonable idea of the volume and value of the timber you're selling. And Ron sold a lot of timber in the lump sum way, where you're just delineating an area and selling, say, all the trees in this area. How much will you pay me? And if you're selling timber that way, you really should have uh, a really good idea, because even though you're getting multiple bids, if all of them for whatever reason are lower than you think are an acceptable price, you need to know that so you can just say, okay, I'm not going to sell right now. Um, but in some cases, it does cost money to get a timber appraisal, to cruise and get evaluation on that timber. And if you're only thinning a couple acres, that cruise, knowing exactly or having that assessment, because a cruise isn't exact, it's a sample with a reasonable estimate. That doesn't really affect the income you get anyway. The income really is determined by how the logs scale at the mill. And just like thinking about the cost of hiring an attorney to do a really careful contract, if you're just logging a little bit of timber where the values aren't great, that might be a big percentage of everything you make. Same thing goes for a cruise. It might cost more for the cruise than you really want to pay given the amount of of volume that's coming out. So for me, this isn't always a must, but you should think that question through and think in your situation, should you have a cruise? And I think in some cases it's really important. There are some cases where maybe a little bit less so. Uh, I've talked about this. You must have a written agreement. I know there's people who do things on a handshake. I've seen it done, and sometimes I've seen it come out fine. But I also know of situations where it's turned out with a real messy, bad situation for the landowner. And so even if it's somebody that you know and trust, everybody I know who's a really legitimate operator expects to have contracts and um, doesn't object to that. It's just kind of standard industry practice, and none of the companies would ever do this without a contract. Uh, you must have evidence that logger's properly insured and you're named as additional insured. So that was one of the slides that I showed and talked about how to do that. You must define who is responsible for paying the timber excise tax. We talked about that. We don't no surprises there. You want to be sure that's clear. Must define who's responsible for replanting. That should be in your timber sale contract. If you expect the logger to do it, if you already know that you're doing it, it's not a problem for you to not have it in there. You must have a clear logger's indemnification clause. So if you look at the any contract I've ever seen, including that one from Oregon State, there'll be a clause that say that the logger indemnifies you from any um, problems that result from their actions, all that kind of stuff. So you'll see those kinds of clauses, and those are very important to have. And you must have a clause in the agreement that states the logger is responsible for following all applicable laws, federal, state, and county regulations. And that just kind of covers a lot of stuff. There's all sorts of rules, whether they're labor laws or fire laws or whatever they might be. So a lot of contracts will state those individually, but at a minimum, be sure you have this clause so that they're responsible for following all of the relevant rules. And I think that's it, Kevin. So I am happy to answer questions in the time we have left.
All right, thanks, Jeff. We have a few questions here. First, a couple of comments that came up. One is that you don't need a permit when you're cutting less than 5,000 board feet per year for personal use only.
Good clarification. Yep. Yep. That
And
my
then,
comments are referring to where you're selling. Yep.
yeah, exactly. And then we have someone who says, unless the law has changed since 1996, selling stumpage is like selling real estate, so you can do a 1031 exchange and defer taxes by using the proceeds to purchase replacement property. Some very specific rules for doing this, easy to do wrong, so hire an expert to help with the 1031.
Good advice, and I would extend that to there's a whole bunch of tax stuff around forest land. Right when you buy forest land, you want to get basis and how you handle your expenses. There's a whole body of knowledge that has to do with taxes that I am no expert on, but there are people who are good at that. Yep.
Those people are hard to find, though. We get often
And the
asked.
good thing is if you're really working at a small scale, the implications usually aren't huge, but that becomes the bigger properties and the more income you're dealing with from timber, those become real important and definitely worth the work of finding a person. And I should say, if you want to learn a little bit about that, there's I believe it's a Forest Service website. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, but there's actually like a timber tax website and some
Yep.
publications about that, and they'll send out annual updates on anything that's changed in tax laws. And so, for those of you who are dealing with bigger amounts of money where this is really important, that's a useful place. Even if you haven't found an accountant or tax attorney who already, if your person doesn't already know a lot about that, you can connect them with that site, and I think those folks know a lot about that.
Yeah, and that site is timbertax.org. I just put that in the chat box. It's a
Perfect.
huge
Thanks.
clearinghouse of information, both state by state and national level for federal income tax.
Oh
Really great
yeah,
resource.
and as I'm sure you can all imagine, there's just a huge body of knowledge that you have to, I don't, it's just more than I can keep track of.
Oh, we had a question about what is the best time for planting seedlings, and want to give a plug for Phil Anderson's talk in the same room at 12:40, and Phil's going to go into great detail on replanting and timing and all that. Do you want to add
Yeah,
anything?
I'll touch briefly on it for anybody who might be listening to a different presentation. So there's two timings that people normally use. The most common is in the spring. And depending on where you are, when I say spring, I might mean January through March if you're not in an area that's snowed out that whole time. If you're at higher elevation or on the east side where snow is held longer, that can get pushed into May. I mean, I've even seen it go into June. But the idea is you want to get your seedlings in the ground as soon as you can in the year so they can start growing their roots and they have a well-established root system before you get to the hot, dry weather. Now, there is an alternative, and you wouldn't do this with bare root seedlings, you do it with plug seedlings, but you can plant in the fall. And the idea there is there's a period of time in the fall where the soil temperatures are still warm enough for root growth, and you get those roots growing, get a jump on things, and they grow again at the beginning of the spring to help better establishment. But what I'll say about that is number one, you have to have seedlings that have been prepared with that in mind. They're hardened off by the nursery with the idea they're going to be lifted in the fall. So you have to make those arrangements. But also, and that's done more commonly on the east side than the west side, although sometimes on the west side. But what can be tricky is you have to have enough soil moisture to do that. But sometimes what happens is we're dry weather all the way up to where it snows, and so you can have your seedlings all ready to go and you don't really get a good window. You don't really want to plant when those soils are dry. So I'll just say those two things. Um, Phil, I'm sure will cover that in much greater detail for those, so anybody who can sit in on that. But if you can't, you can dig into it. I think these will be recorded, right, Kevin? So if somebody was listening to something else, they could go back and hear Phil's more thorough coverage of that topic.
Yes, that's correct. We're recording all of these. Here's an interesting question for you. If there's an easement in place and logs are harvested in the easement, is a permit needed? Is a harvest plan needed? Who owns the harvested trees?
I guess I don't know the answer to that, but I think this is a non-legal, uneducated opinion. My understanding, the easement is just giving you the right to drive over that. It's not giving you control, the ownership of that property or anything on it. So, but I mean, it's possible that easements could be written different ways. But my assumption would be that whoever has the underlying land that easement crosses is the timber owner. But my advice is to ask someone who has the proper legal background to answer that. I haven't come across that um, problem where um, in dealing with the small lenders, I'm usually the road has already been there.
Okay. Well, here's a question that I think is on a lot of people's mind as they're thinking about possibly harvesting. How do I figure out if the harvest will pay for itself? I have 20 acres mixed, maybe 10 mixed loads. Is there a threshold of loads that makes the break even point?
I would say there's not. Well, there's so many things that go into that. Okay, so one is the value of the timber and the volume, and in the volume it determines how many loads. Another is your haul distance. Another is the I guess already mentioned value, but like what you're going to get paid at the mill and all that sort of thing. Um, so there's a few answers, I guess. The best answers I think is get a consulting forester to come and take a look at it with you and help you make that decision. If you're doing it on your own, if the if say you're doing it on your own and you're working on a split or something like that, one way to know if it's not worth it is logger's not going to take it if it doesn't pay its way out, you know. Uh, but I don't think there's a threshold in terms of loads if you're dealing with very small scale folks. I mean, I know loggers who have gone in just to take one or two loads of danger trees near a house. So if you're talking to the person with the right setup, their move-in costs are fairly low, provided that the timber has some value. You know, if it's just low value stuff that's not worth anything but pulp, that might be tough. And but in that circumstance, depending on the timing, you might be able to get the logger to do it for cost. In other words, you're not going to make any money, but the logger will get those out of there for you if he can, make a little bit of money on the pulp. But again, that depends on how far he is to haul it and what pulp prices are and that sort of thing.
So, Jeff, if somebody was just curious about whether they could make any money doing some harvesting on their property, it sounds like they should call a consulting forester to come out and give it a look over, and who will have a sense of that, or a logger.
I mean I think that makes sense. Have someone take a look at it. You know what? Yeah, I think having and as you guys often recommend, I want to be careful about pushing too hard in the consulting. I don't want to. I want this to be educational, not self-serving. But I think a lot of us who have experience in the small landowner community uh, would tell landowners there's a lot of value in working with a forester, and we've all seen some situations where um, you know there's some people, most loggers, all loggers that we work with are good, reputable folks, but we've all seen some situations that haven't turned out so well for the landowner. But yeah, I think getting advice from someone who knows the markets and a little bit about timber and that sort of thing is probably a good first step. And yeah, that's what I would say.
We have a question, and might be best to let Phil expound on this in his afternoon talk. But the question is, what do you think of using a pre-emergent spray before planting?
I'll let Phil cover it in more detail, but I'll say that that's common practice at the commercial scale. But there's a lot to know about that. I'll also say that, don't there's cases where the wrong chemical or the wrong timing could hurt or on the wrong soil could hurt your trees. So I'll leave the rest for Phil.
All right. The next question is, do city permitting requirements for harvesting override county requirements, or is there a need to take the requirements of both jurisdictions into consideration? So, yeah, you've got overlapping maybe city, county, and state regulations.
In my experience has been that and this probably depends on where you are. That's the thing that makes it tough to answer questions like this. But in the case where I've been inside city limits, it was the city that had jurisdiction. In the county, either the state or DNR might have jurisdiction, depending again on whether you're changing land use or not. And I also think there are places, I think King County is one of the examples where even if you're strictly on forest land, if you're in, I believe it's the urban growth boundary, then it still defaults to county. Does that sound right, Kevin?
Yeah,
I
that
we I
that
worked in a
does.
lot
I'm
of
not
counties, and sometimes I
positive, but
I don't
yeah.
keep it. Yeah, I mean, I always at the very beginning of a project, I always clarify who has jurisdiction, and a good way to do that is to call the DNR Forest Practice Office and tell them your exact location, and they can look it up and they can tell you who has jurisdiction. But I think it could be any of those, and but I actually have done a small thinning where we were in city limits, and that was a city permit in the case where I was working.